What have you got for us today, Ligeia?
I have the SCP Foundation of Antiquity. I
I
know this.
love your bizarre description of things simply because it makes sense, but it's also super out there. So
Yeah.
what are you talking about? The SCP Foundation of Antiquities?
Well, maybe we should go into the SCP Foundation first. Um,
Okay, if you want.
so I think most of us know the SCP Foundation. You have done a couple of videos on the SCP Foundation and of some of their cryptids. Um, and the special thing about the SCP Foundation is that monsters are described in a very rational way. So it's really just like zoology to them. They explain what the monsters are like and how to handle them, how dangerous they are, and so on. You almost have this feeling that you're reading a scientific essay about these monsters.
Mm,
And that is basically how people describe monsters in antique texts. So Pliny the Elder, the Roman scholar, he described in his book Naturalis Historia ordinary animals. He described plants, he described volcanoes, and so on. So this was all the science they had collected. And in the part about zoology, he describes ordinary animals, but he also describes animals that are mythical, but he describes them in the same way. So this almost feels like an SCP Foundation thing, where he has a very scientific approach for this, but you know clearly that there are no unicorns.
I should probably put a spoiler warning for this video about unicorns, just for those who might not be ready for that information yet, Ligeia.
Yes, we should do that.
I
So
mean,
we will go.
it's the national animal of Scotland. I mean, come on, it's got to be real.
It could be. But we'll get into that when we're talking about unicorns. So I think we should get into some monsters. We will have single episodes about a specific monster. But first of all, I'd like to go into the term monster and what it could mean, because as I said, Pliny also described ordinary animals.
Makes
Um,
sense. Okay.
so the word monster is a Latin word, and it comes from the Latin verb monstrare, which means to point at something or to show something. So a monster is something extraordinary that you would point at.
Like like literally point at.
Oh no, it doesn't mean point at literally, but it means to show something. And you have this word in modern words like demonstration, for example. When you have a demonstration, that's a presentation, you're showing something.
Okay. Okay. I got you.
So it doesn't mean unusual animals, and it doesn't mean evil animals or something like that. It just means something that you would show to others, something
Hmm.
that is extraordinary.
Almost like circus shows and stuff too. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And that was part of it. So there was a time when there was no difference between zoos and circuses, where both just serve the purpose of showing people animals that they usually wouldn't get to see.
Hmm. Okay. Except I suppose
Um,
circuses took it a little bit more extreme, didn't they? It was like more of the wow factor behind it.
yes, they also trained animals, of course, but you know, circuses started as something that was connected to Roman gladiator games.
I could
Um,
see the connection. Yeah, because it's
yeah,
all about entertaining the masses, really.
right. You bring in some lions from Africa, and I mean, you wouldn't even have to go that far. You could bring in lions from the Middle East or from Greece, because at that time there were lions in Greece. They just went extinct in historical times. But these were animals that people living in the city of Rome wouldn't get to see.
Hmm.
So it was showing them some animals that they usually wouldn't get to see.
Okay, I'm with you so far.
Good. There are three big phases of discovering monsters, and the first is antiquity. So we have something like the Naturalis Historia by Pliny the Elder. He lived from 23 to 79 AD. This is already historical times. And then there was also a Greek book called the Physiologus, and the Physiologus became the foundation for the medieval Bestiaries. This is a book that also mixes existing animals with mythical animals, and that was written in the 2nd to 4th century AD. And I think it was first written in Greek. That is the old phase of discovering monsters. So the old phase of discovering monsters started because people suddenly had better infrastructure. You know that the Romans built all kinds of roads and walls. And I mean, you have a couple of walls and castles in England too, right?
Tons.
It's it's very durable architecture.
It sure
So
is.
these roads were used to travel not only further but also faster and better, which meant that people could go to regions of the world that had been inaccessible for a long time. So they started to investigate all sorts of animals and plants and minerals and stuff. So this is what Pliny's book is about, that you can finally travel in a much easier manner and you can see all these things and you can describe these things. So they always had this interest, but for a very long time it wasn't really possible to get to these places. And he, for example, describes animals that live in Africa. So Africa is a continent that wasn't explored for a very long time. Only little bits of it were explored in antiquity. Yes, so they ran into lots of weird animals. They described these animals, and sometimes we don't really know what they described. So in some cases, we can recognize the animal. We know what they meant by this, even though the name may have been different. But in some cases, we're completely clueless and we have no idea what they were actually describing.
So I'm guessing they didn't have any sketches in these older books then.
Well, none that survived. You know, the fall of Rome posed a small problem.
Got a point.
In Europe, you had a lot of war. So things would go up in flames regularly. And even though we had libraries, we had very old libraries in Greece, even in Egypt, these things did not necessarily survive. So if there were any drawings, then they didn't make it.
That's fair. Yeah.
Okay, this is the first phase. The second phase also has something to do with traveling. And that was the phase during the Crusades, because the East clashed with the West, and it was a fight that concerned the Silk Road area. So maybe you know that the Silk Road started in Xi'an, which is in central China, and it went through Central Asia and the Middle East to Egypt. So the other end point would have been in Egypt. And then, of course, there were some routes on the Silk Road that led to places like Byzantium. So Byzantium was not directly on the Silk Road, but it was one of the minor endpoints of the Silk Road. And this trade was very important, and it was important for about 4,000 years. So this started about 2000 BC, and the Chinese actually only joined 1000 BC. So for 1,000 years, this was something that only people in the Middle East and Central Asia and Europe and North Africa did. And after that, China joined.
Feel like I'm back in school.
Sorry.
No, it's good. It's a really good refresher on it, because I remember learning about the Silk Road. I didn't remember the specific dates or anything, but I did know that it basically connected a vast majority of countries together across Europe and Asia and Egypt. I mean, I'm sure they mentioned Egypt as well, but it's just another great reminder of these things.
Right, and the Islamic expansion disrupted the Silk Road, and that was the ultimate reason why Columbus had to sail to the west to find a way to China across the sea, because Islam finally cut off the Silk Road from Europe. That was a big problem. So they caused this. Columbus would not have sailed if the Silk Road had been intact at that point. But we're not
Wow.
talking about that now. We're a bit earlier on. The Crusades were before that point in time when Islam took over Byzantium. So during the Crusades, you had these French knights, and weirdly enough, it's mostly French knights who brought home these stories. We've talked about this when we were talking about 1001 Nights, that the Arabs found these stories when they conquered Persia, and then the French somehow got it from the Arabs. And that was the case during the Crusades. The French went around, and I don't know if they did any fighting at all. I think they just collected stories.
I mean, I'm sure there was like maybe a level of fighting they did since they were quote unquote warrior monks, but you're quite right. They more enjoyed kind of stealing things from other nations and religions.
Oh, I will be careful with that because, England and France were connected at that time, and Richard Lionheart was a French king as well. He had territories in France.
Yeah, well, look how that's all turned out.
All right, so they are the ones who brought many stories and many things from the Orient to Europe. And you have these books popping up, mostly written by monks or collected by monks, but you can be sure that a lot of the information got transferred to Europe by the French, because that's what they did back then. And these monks would write bestiaries, and bestiaries are collections of unusual animals. But again, it's not only unusual and mythical animals, it's also animals that are technically known to us today, like wolves, for example. But they describe them in weird ways. So they explain a behavior that we don't see nowadays. It's not the actual behavior of wolves, it's something that is connected to religion. So they were trying to tell a story, they were trying to make a point, and to use these animals for religious examples. That can happen in these bestiaries. So you should not trust the bestiaries to be zoologically accurate. But a lot more animals came to Europe through these bestiaries. So people got to know a lot more animals. And when you see lions, for example, or leopards, when you see them in coats of arms of that time, those were mythical animals to people in Europe because they had never seen them. Well, maybe some old Romans had seen them, but people in Northern Europe, in England, for example, they had never seen a lion. To them, it didn't make a difference whether you presented them with a lion or a dragon. Both were animals that they had never seen, and that they were and that they thought were probably mythical.
Mm. Yeah, I see the logic. That makes total sense.
Right, and they still use them for their coats of arms.
Sure do. It's a representation, okay? It's a beautiful thing.
Yes, it's cool. So that is the second phase, and we're getting some more animals. And some of these animals in the second phase come from places like India or China. So they come from places that the Romans didn't really explore in the East. And you have elephants in there, you have oysters in there. So the oyster, for example, is sometimes described as a stone that has an animal in it. So kind of a living stone.
I mean, I suppose I could see how somebody having no idea what some animals and things could be like could see that as a living stone. Yeah, I can understand.
Right. And one important thing for medieval monks, it's barnacle geese.
Barnacle
Right.
geese?
Yes, barnacle geese are vegetable geese. So you've probably heard that during the Lent, you're not supposed to eat meat.
Yeah.
Yes, and monks wanted to eat meat during the Lent. So
I
they
mean,
had
as does everybody, right? That does Lent.
so they had to come up with an excuse. And they invented a magical tree that grows geese as fruits.
Geese.
Yes. So they this is all described in the manner that you would describe an SCP.
And this is in a bestiary.
Yes, this is a medieval
Okay.
bestiary.
Okay. It's making a little more sense now. I'm with you.
So the barnacle geese, they're attached by their beaks. So the beak is the point where they grow out of the tree, and they hang from the tree like fruits by their beaks.
Okay.
And they can be harvested from the tree, and then you can eat them. And technically, it's allowed to eat them because
Because it's technically
fruit.
not
Yeah.
meat. Yeah. Okay. That's
They probably got this idea from a non-animal from Central Asia that was known as the lamb of Tartary. And the lamb of Tartary is allegedly a plant that grows sheep as a fruit. So it's a vegetable sheep, and it's attached to the plant by some sort of green umbilical cord. You know, almost like a pumpkin. um, so this
okay.
this umbilical cord or this vine, it attaches the sheep to the plant, so it's like a leash. It can't leave the plant, but as soon as it's ready, it starts eating the grass around the plant. And people in Central Asia, they find these sheep and they share them, and they get wool from them. And it's very convenient because predators like wolves and lions are not interested in these vegetable sheep because they're plants.
This is such a strange story.
But this is, again, something that is absolutely 100% real. So, can you imagine what the vegetable lamb of Tartary is in real life?
No, I couldn't even remotely imagine. I mean, the only thing I could think of that first pops into my head about any kind of a plant that potentially could eat something is like a Venus flytrap, for example.
Oh, but that is not the point. So it's not about the sheep plant eating grass, but it's about the wool. So this is the cotton plant.
Oh, okay. I mean that. I suppose yeah. That makes sense. Still
Um,
really bizarre how they decided to phrase it, but okay.
I think it's a case of miscommunication because, you know, they didn't speak each other's languages. And maybe if you had an Arab prisoner of war who had been on the Silk Road and who had seen cotton fields in what is now Pakistan, for example, or in Central Asian countries, he would have told them about cotton, and he would have tried to explain it to them that this is a substance that resembles sheep wool. But maybe he didn't know enough Latin or Greek or French to explain to them what it really was like. So they guessed what it was like, and they thought, "Oh, this is a sheep plant, obviously."
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. A whole lot of lost in translation, and then they take it literally because they don't want to try to verify the information. Yeah, I could
Right.
see that.
So they
Okay.
wrote this down, and I think that the barnacle geese, the vegetable geese, they may have been invented afterwards because these monks thought, well, we have evidence that there is a sheep plant in Central Asia, so why not invent a tree that grows geese?
Why not? And then just have everybody in an uproar around Lent time when it turns out, oh hey, yeah, it's not an actual thing.
I don't think the peasants ever found out. Or maybe they did and we just didn't hear about it. There could have been
Yeah,
riots.
I mean, it's not like the peasants were writing things down.
No, usually not. So this is phase 2, and phase 3 of discovering monsters, that would be the European Age of Exploration. And technically, that starts with the Portuguese trying to find a way around Africa. And shortly after that, Columbus sails to the Americas. But what I'm talking about is the last phase of the Age of Exploration. So this would be more like the late 18th and the 19th century,
Okay.
when you had people in the Amazon, for example, or in Central Africa. So in all of these places that had not really been explored before because they were too remote, or it was too difficult to get there or too difficult to survive there. And during that time, people also came up with all sorts of monsters. So we have reports about real animals again. And then we have reports about animals that we really can't pinpoint. We have no idea what they could be. And there are actually some funny reports about animals that could be scientific jokes, like Stella's sea ape.
Stella's
Um,
sea ape.
yes, so this was on an Arctic exploration. And Stella was, I think, the zoologist, but well, he described animals on that trip, and he described Stella's sea cows, for example, which are now extinct. And maybe you've read about them in the Jungle Book, because there is a short episode about Stella's sea cows. And he also described Stella's sea ape. And nobody was able to find that sea ape. Nobody has any idea what it could have been. So some people think it may have been a joke because, you know, it's a sea ape with reddish hair. And it could be a parody of the captain of Stella's ship back in the times, because he was a ginger man from Denmark. And Stella named the sea ape the Danish sea ape.
All signs point to a mockery of that.
Right. So those were some of the monsters, and of course, a lot of these monsters later turned out to be not to be monsters. For example, in this last phase that includes the early 1900s, we have people finding animals like gorillas and okapis in the Congo. Those had been presented as monsters, as mythical animals, but people were able to prove that they're not. So sometimes we're just talking about animals that are not discovered yet, basically cryptids. And when people find them, they stop being monsters. But overall, you have 5 categories. So monsters can be ordinary animals. Monsters can be extinct animals. Sometimes you just find bones and you conclude that you found dragon bones because, you know, dinosaur bones look like dragon bones.
Yeah, you don't know any better. I get it.
Then the third category is allegorical, like during the Crusades in the second phase, that monks would simply use animals to bring across a religious point and use them as a religious allegory, which was done with a pelican, for example. So the pelican allegedly feeds his own young with his own blood from his chest. And that was seen as something that Christ would do for humankind, that he would sacrifice himself for humankind. So the pelican was used as a religious allegory in that case. Then we have another category that is misidentified animals. So maybe you've seen something, you were not sure what it was, and you've described it in a way that people simply can't recognize it anymore later. And the fifth one is unknown animals. So we should keep the possibility open that there are unknown animals out there that we would probably call cryptids nowadays, and that there are still animals that can be discovered, especially in remote areas like the Congo, for example.
I mean, we are still discovering animals. I wouldn't say every single day, but I do know that we're still able to discover new species. At least a
Yes,
couple
and
every year, you know?
yes, and we have evolution. One scary thing I read about is that great white sharks are now growing bigger and bigger and bigger because they seemingly have to replace megalodon.
Well, I mean, can we just tell the sharks to not replace the megalodon? That'd be cool,
No.
right?
I mean, the megalodon has been gone for a while. And it's not that great white sharks suddenly started with this, but they have been getting bigger gradually. So the idea that some marine biologists have is that there is an apex predator of a certain size needed in the ecosystem. So the great white sharks rise to the occasion, and they're getting much bigger than they originally were. So they were smaller when they were still swimming with megalodons.
Well, that's a scary thought. That one day in the future there could be not just one megalodon, but multiple. Wow.
Oh, you think there is a megalodon in the Mariana Trench?
I don't think it's impossible. You know, I mean, we still don't know what all is down there. It's, you know, well, it's just the craziest thing in reality, really, isn't it? Just the deepest point that we can't explore. It's crazy.
Yes, but they wouldn't survive the pressure. So I can send you a really good link to a video that deals with this, and it's not very likely that they still exist
I
because we
wonder if
would have
there are any sharks that could, though.
that could take their place.
Well, that could survive the pressure down there. Because if so, that's horrifying.
Sorry, you have sharks adapting to moving across land. There is a small species of shark, I think they live in Australia, and they are learning to move across rocks outside of the water.
God damn it! It's always Australia with these scary things going on. They got to put us up to this. It's can't have land sharks.
There must be something in the water.
I think there's many things in the water over there.
Yes, and not just sharks. I mean the drinking water.
Well, we love you, Australia. Nothing against you.
Yes, but I have this background in anthropology. So when you have weird things that belong to the cultural sphere, we always say, well, if it exists, then it must exist in Papua New Guinea, because that is ethno land, that is the place where all of this weird stuff can happen. And biologists have the same thing. They say, well, if it exists, then in Australia, because that is the place where all the weird biological stuff exists.
Papua New Guinea and Australia. You just blame all your problems on them. I love it.
Yes, I mean they're very close, so you wouldn't have to travel far. It's just across the sea, same area of the world.
Those poor people. It's not their fault.
Yeah, so by the way, Papua New Guinea might also be a place where we can find some weird animals. For example, they have probably a flying dinosaur that is called the ropen.
Oh yeah.
Yes, but there's evidence that it may just be a hoax or may just be something that was misunderstood. So, yes, you could say we could go on a trip to find the ropen, the flying dinosaur, but it's possible that it's not actually a flying dinosaur, that it's just something that is misidentified. So, but it's credible because it happens in Papua New Guinea.
I see. So it carries a little bit of merit because of that, even though it could still be a hoax. I mean,
Right.
there are lizards that can kind of fly, like little glider wings and stuff, but never heard of anything too big, lizard-wise, being able to properly fly like a dragon or a dinosaur.
Yes, so there is also kind of a flying dinosaur in the Congo, allegedly. And you have a lot of stuff going on there because it's really remote and it's one of the last places on Earth that was discovered by the Western world. So people believe that there are still dinosaurs in the Congo, like you've probably heard of the Mokele-mbembe.
I have. I don't know why though. Bembe. Where
That
the?
is allegedly a long-necked dinosaur, like similar to a sauropod.
Okay. Okay.
There is a slight possibility that Middle Eastern unicorns could be a reflection of Parasaurolophus.
I'm sorry. Can we go back to Middle Eastern unicorns? What?
Yes. Okay. There is a slight possibility that Middle Eastern unicorns could be a reflection of Parasaurolophus. And that is a dinosaur that has a distinct horn on its head that
Yeah.
points backwards. So maybe you've seen them. It
Yeah.
doesn't point to the front, but to the back.
It's in
And
Jurassic Park. I've seen them.
oh, I think in the second one, The Lost World, right?
That's right. That's right.
They were catching them. So we know what they sounded like because scientists were actually able to reconstruct the sound chamber in this horn. So you can play it like a flute and it makes a sound. And this is the most we know about dinosaur sounds because this is literally an instrument that you can play. And it really sounds like one of the pipes in an organ. It has that sound.
Spooky.
And there is, among the first phase monster discoveries, there's a description of Middle Eastern unicorns that have a horn on their head, and they can play music with this horn, and this is how they attract people. And then they eat them.
What?
Yeah, this doesn't sound like a rhino, right? You would
No.
expect this to be a rhino. Like when we're talking about unicorns, you would probably think this must be a rhino. But there were unicorns described that live in the Middle East, on the Arabian Peninsula, for example, and they play music with their horns and attract people, and then they eat them.
I bet you this is in 1001 Nights. There's got to be one.
No, I think it's Pliny. I'm pretty sure it's Pliny.
That's so strange. So, how many cultures have potentially had unicorn sightings?
Yes, but these are carnivorous unicorn.
Well, yeah, it's certainly a little bit more drastic, no doubt, but it's still interesting that out of all creatures, it would still be a kind of a unicorn.
Yes, and in that case, that could really be a surviving dinosaur. So maybe they're not there anymore because we would have found them. But Pliny, that is in the 1st century AD, so almost 1,000 years ago. Sorry, 2,000 years ago. And he described this. So the reason why some people believe that these Middle Eastern carnivorous sorry.
Carnivorous uniforms, yes, go on.
Carnivorous uniforms, that too, yeah. Why these? Sorry, the reason why some people believe that these carnivorous Middle Eastern unicorns might be Parasaurolophus is that they recognize the horn that they're playing sounds with. So technically, if you saw a Parasaurolophus on all fours with a giant horn on its head that plays music, that might look like a unicorn. Like they could walk on all fours. And as for the carnivorous part, that is not correct as far as we know. They were herbivores. But there is a possibility that if, let's say, a small population of them survived in the Arabian Peninsula, that they were also victims of evolution. They simply developed, they adapted to the environment, and they would usually need something like a swamp, or they at least would need an area where there's enough plant material that they can snack on. And if they don't have that, maybe they turn to a more omnivorous diet. So they didn't completely leave the plant diet behind, but perhaps they started eating meat as a substitute because they couldn't get enough energy from plants. And that is really interesting to think that maybe 2,000 years ago, they may still have some Parasaurolophus in the Middle East who played music with their horns to attract people and eat them.
It would be insane if there is any level of truth to that.
But it's probably not true. So, yes, but definitely interesting. Okay, I would like to repeat what we've been talking about. We have 3 phases of exploration, 3 monster phases in history. The first is in Antiquity, the second is around the Crusades, and the third is at the end of the European Age of Exploration. And we have 5 categories of monsters. We have monsters that turned out to be ordinary animals, like gorillas and okapis, for example. We have extinct animals, often based on the discovery of bones, like you find some dinosaur bones and you think it's a dragon. Then we have allegorical animals and misidentified animals, and finally unknown animals. So we've talked a little bit about the single animals that we would like to look at in future. Sorry, that we would like to look into in future episodes. I think you wanted to start with mermaids.
It's such a fun thing, and I think mermaids are always going to be a very popular theme, whether it be for children or for people who are just super curious about mermaids in general. Because I think one of the most incredible things about mermaids is the fact that it's not just like a couple of potential stories about maybe mermaid sightings. I mean, as you've even said before in previous times of our conversations, the fact there are mermaid sightings basically all over the world of different kinds of colors and races
Mhm.
and stuff like that. It expands this bizarre horizon of the fact that it's not just one kind of a mermaid. There are multiple versions and multiple stories based around those creatures, and I think that's just it's just so cool to be able to like really look into it, you know.
Yes, and there can be different animals that can be identified as mermaids. So I think I've shown you the sea cows, and I've shown you the rays,
Yep.
um, and I've shown you the Fiji mermaid that Barnum
Oh
was
yes.
showing
Oh
in his
yes.
exhibition.
The weird little freak. Poor guy. It's not his fault. Well, let's not spoil it.
Yes, and I think you also have some native British mermaids, but not exactly English ones, but Scottish ones.
Yes, and then there's also down in Cornwall as well where there's been some sightings, quote unquote.
So we could go into that. That would be really interesting. Is there a chance that we will watch Mermaids: The Body Found, that mockumentary about mermaids?
I'd have to see how copyright protected it is. But
Mm.
I mean, we could still watch it ourselves, even just as like a little Discord community. Like that, that wouldn't be a problem as long as I'm not recording or streaming it without knowing the full ramifications. That's the only thing I have to look into. But that will be my homework.
Good, because I think it's really well made. So, of course, you can see that a lot of it is CGI and that there are some practical effects. And as an educated person, you would probably know that these things did not happen like this. So, if you have a little background in science, then you would know that this is simply not possible. But it's very well made, and they have some good actors in it. So it's convincing, I would say, for a large portion of people who are not that deep into the topic.
Hmm. Well, it definitely sounds like something I need to find out if we can watch it. And I mean, like I say, if we can't record us watching and talking about bits of it, then we'll just have it as like a Discord event for people there. I think that'd be really cute fun. For this episode, I think we've covered covered quite a little bit about the explanation and potential thoughts behind the word monster and how it can be classified. I thought that was fantastic information you gave us, Ligeia. What a great way for us going forward to actually start talking about monsters.
It's appropriate to call this the SCP Foundation of Antiquity. When you look into these descriptions, for example, so again, the SCPs, they're very well documented usually with scientific language, and you
Mm-hmm.
can look into these bestiaries, or into these descriptions of animals in antiquity. And for example, when we're talking about the phoenix, that animal that goes up in flames and then rises from the ashes again, um, they didn't just describe it like that. They actually described where they were nesting and how the nests were built, what they looked like. So they call they called the nests little mounds, and they are shaped like a bowling pin. That is what they said about the nests of these phoenixes. And I think that is such a great detail. So, very often they have these specific details about these monsters. And it's not just telling a spooky story, it's really trying to describe them in a scientific way. And that's what connects it to SCP for me.
I could definitely see that the intricate little details, and yet again, like you mentioned, the fact that it feels almost like you're looking at a scientist's notes and examinations, for example, in the SCP stuff, which is very true. A lot of it can be very much like that, and it feels very dry at parts, But it's interesting the way it's structured. I think you're totally right.
Right, and it makes it spookier that it's so dry. You think, well, somebody who would tell me a story that is unlikely, or that has monsters in it that simply don't exist. Somebody like that would probably make it a little bit more exciting, and would use a more sorry would use a they would use an approach that more resembles literature or that resembles the structure of a movie, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So it's unusual to make it that dry because usually you would like people to get excited about your monsters. You want to give them a spooky story that they can really get into, that they can relate to. But it grips you even more when it's just some boring protocol.
Yeah, but I guess it makes it feel a little bit more real, right? And that's probably a big draw for it. Even though it's obviously not real. Like, I mean, you read 3 or 4 of them, and all of a sudden you're like, yeah, okay, this isn't real. But it's just structured in such a way where, like, at least it's taken quite seriously, so it does feel real. I think that's a big part of it.
Yes, although I must say you can make it a little more interesting for people when you go into these clusters of stories. I don't know if you've found them yet, but for example, there is a food cluster of SCPs, and it only describes SCPs that are connected to food. Like there are SCPs that are literally chewing gums.
Yeah. And then I think there's one that's weed, for example, like it's like a rolled up joint. There's some there's one that's basically a staircase. I mean, it gets all over the place as SCP creations. I think it's just it's not just creatures, they can be concepts as well as inanimate objects. I think it's great.
Right. So one idea for the future may be that we could go into these clusters and have a series of stories that are only related to edible SCPs and what they do to you.
Yeah,
Like
okay.
the food and drink that Alice in Wonderland consumes, for example, that would be classified as an SCP, right?
I would think so. Yeah, a drink that can make you smaller, but then also one that can make you bigger. That's certainly pretty freaking strange.
Right, and some SCPs are like that. So that would be interesting, or just go into SCPs that are animals or resemble animals that actually exist.
Yep,
Um,
yep.
yes. All right. Then let's prepare the mermaid episode, and thank you for having me today.
Absolutely. Thanks for being here, Ligeia. This has been it's been a great little time. We sure hope you've learned quite a lot about monsters and had some interesting thoughts along this journey. Let us know down below if there's any specific monsters or even SCP things that you think we should cover next. Because the more you ask for it, the more likely it'll happen. Well, thank you yet again, Ligeia, for regaling us on this crazy
Pleasure.
journey of teaching us so many cool things. She is just a treasure trove of knowledge, and I think it's one of the coolest things to just kind of dissect the brain and learn all the cool things they share. And that's why we're doing this, because she knows some really fucking weird stories. And they're worth sharing. People want to hear this. It's great. Thank
Well,
you
you
so
need to
much, Ligeia.
understand. Well, you need to understand. I'm a fucking weird person, so that explains it.
It's the best way to be sometimes. Nothing wrong with being a little weird.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.
Take care.
Thank you so much to my YouTube members and Patreon members for all the love and support. It's thanks to people like you that we can keep growing.